The archivist's gloved hand hovered over the box marked RG 226 OSS Records 1945 Restricted. Inside the National Archives facility in College Park, Maryland, on a Tuesday morning in January 2025, she could open it, catalog the folder tabs, photograph the cover sheets, but 37 pages deeper into that stack, a red stamp still held the line. Classified, sources and methods protected. 80 years after the war ended, governments around the world continued to guard secrets from a conflict that killed 75 million people and reshaped every border on the map. The math seems absurd at first glance. Anyone who held operational authority in World War II, planners, spies, commanders, has been dead for decades. The youngest combat veteran alive in 2025 would have been 17 in 1945. Making them 97 years old today. The weapons are museum pieces, the battlefields are monuments. The geopolitical order they fought to establish has fractured and reformed 3 times over. Yet in Washington, London, Moscow, Paris, and Berlin, clerks continue to stamp files with exemptions, archivists continue to defer release dates, and lawyers continue to argue that disclosure would damage national security or violate privacy law. The U.S. National Declassification Center, a bureaucratic entity most Americans have never heard of, announced in its quarterly report for the first quarter of 2025 that it had processed and released another 16,000 pages of World War II-era intelligence files. Processed, released. Both terms do heavy lifting. Processing means reviewing each page for names, methods, and cross-references that might justify continued secrecy. Released means the pages that survive redaction are made public. The pages that don't survive, blacked out, withheld entirely, or transferred to other agencies, remain in legal limbo, often for reasons the public will never know. Before you dismiss this as bureaucratic inertia or paranoia, consider what is actually in these files. Not battle plans, not troop movements, not the kind of tactical intelligence that loses value the moment the shooting stops. The files still sealed in 2025 contain something far more volatile. Names, locations, relationships, moral bargains, technical secrets that became the foundation of Cold War arsenals, diplomatic cables that reveal bargains still cited in modern territorial disputes, lists of informants whose grandchildren still live in politically unstable regions, evidence of collaboration, immunity deals, and forced repatriations that governments would prefer to forget. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know. And if you're interested in the hidden mechanics of history, the stories that don't make it into the textbooks, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. The scope of what remains classified is staggering. In the United Kingdom, files related to Ultra, the signals intelligence breakthrough at Bletchley Park that cracked German Enigma and Lorenz ciphers, were kept secret until the 1970s. Nearly 30 years after the war, when the British government finally acknowledged Ultra's existence, historians realized that entire narratives of the war had been written in ignorance of the Allies' most decisive advantage. But even today, portions of Ultra-related files remain redacted. The justification? Protecting sources and methods? The argument runs that revealing exactly how codebreakers exploited specific weaknesses in German encryption could inform modern adversaries about vulnerabilities in contemporary systems. It sounds reasonable until you remember that Enigma machines are museum artifacts, and the encryption methods they employed are taught in undergraduate computer science courses. The real reason becomes clearer when you look at what the redacted sections actually protect. Not the mathematics of code breaking, but the human networks that made it possible. The couriers who carried intercepted messages, the resistance contacts who photographed code books, the turned agents who provided keys. Some of those people, or their children, are still alive. Some of them live in countries where exposure would mean legal jeopardy or social ruin. The trail goes deeper. In Moscow, the Russian State Archive holds thousands of NKVD and SMERSH files from 1943 through 1945, arrest dossiers, execution lists, interrogation transcripts, agent reports. In the early 2020s, the Russian government began selective declassification, releasing portions of files related to wartime counterintelligence operations. The releases came with a pattern. Documents that showed Soviet efficiency and heroism, published. Documents that showed collaboration with Western intelligence or revealed names of informants in regions now contested, sealed. The official justification cited national security, but historians noted that the files most likely to remain classified were those that complicated the Kremlin's preferred narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Every government has its version of this selective memory. The Vatican archives contain thousands of wartime liaison cables between Allied governments and the Holy See. Many of these cables include the names of clergy who sheltered refugees, arranged safe passage, or passed intelligence to Allied handlers. The Church argues, not without reason, that releasing these names could endanger families whose relatives collaborated with occupying forces or expose compromises that would damage institutional reputation. A parish priest in occupied France, who hid Allied pilots in his rectory, may also have filed weekly reports with German authorities to maintain his cover. Publishing his name 80 years later serves historical truth but destroys the legacy his descendants have built. What would you do if you were the archivist holding that file? Many of the files still sealed in 2025 are not about battlefield secrets. They are about aftermath, property restitution paperwork, numbered inventory sheets, photographs, claimant affidavits for looted art and real estate, diplomatic settlement plans that were never publicly ratified but still affect modern territorial claims, technical blueprints for captured German weapons research, V-weapons, jet engines, rocket designs, shared among allies and later adapted into Cold War arsenals, interrogation transcripts that capture not just answers but cadence, hesitation, the raw texture of fear and negotiation, lists of collaborators who later became sources for Western intelligence and were given immunity in exchange for testimony, files that are less about history and more about liability, because here is the uncomfortable truth that governments understood from the moment the war ended. Declassifying everything would not just illuminate the past, it would detonate the present, it would trigger lawsuits, reparations claims, diplomatic crises, it would expose moral compromises that undergird modern alliances, it would name names that powerful people would prefer to keep buried. The files are not hidden because they are secret. They are hidden because they are expensive. But what happens when the final veteran dies, when the last living link to the war disappears? What happens when there is no one left who can be harmed by the truth? Governments will still find reasons. They always do. Because the secrets buried in these files are not just about 1945. They're about 1946, 1950, 1960, the decades when those wartime relationships, those intelligence assets, those technical discoveries were repurposed for the next conflict. The files form a chain, pull one link, and the whole structure shifts. In a temperature-controlled vault beneath the streets of Washington, an archivist closes the box she has been reviewing. 37 pages deeper, the red stamp remains. She logs the box number, notes the restriction, and moves to the next. The system continues. The secrets hold. But what exactly are they protecting? A British MI5 memo dated March 7, 1944, describes an informant with the code name Cicada. Physical description: small build, scar on left cheek, limp on right side, occupation, tailor, location, Brussels, 4th arrondissement, handler notes, reliable, nervous disposition. Brought 3 rolls of film, 2 code books. That level of detail, granular, identifying, permanent, is exactly why the file remains partially redacted in 2025. The files governments continue to protect are not abstract policy documents or sanitized after-action reports. They are raw, human, achingly specific. They contain the texture of lived experience, handwritten addresses, physical descriptions, sensory observations, the precise words spoken under interrogation. These micro-details make the files invaluable to historians seeking to reconstruct the war as it was actually experienced. They also make the files dangerous to release, because specificity is identification, and identification even 80 years later can destroy lives. Consider what a single page from a classified OSS operational report actually contains. Location: a safe house outside Lyon, France. Date: November 12, 1944. The report describes an exfiltration operation, moving Allied airmen and resistance fighters across the Pyrenees into Spain. But the operational details are not what keeps the file classified. What keeps it sealed are the names. Madame R., proprietor of the café on Rue Saint-Jean, provided lodging and false papers. Her daughter, aged 16, served as courier. Brother-in-law, municipal clerk, stamped exit permits without question. Release that file today, and you expose a family whose descendants may have built reputations on entirely different wartime stories. The grandmother who was a quiet patriot becomes the woman who collaborated closely enough with Allied intelligence to have intimate operational knowledge. The great-uncle who survived the occupation with his civil service job intact becomes the man who falsified official documents. Truth, but inconvenient truth. Historical record, but socially explosive. This is the paradox at the heart of wartime declassification. The closer you get to useful historical detail, the closer you get to actionable personal information. Interrogation transcripts reveal the problem in stark relief. When Allied intelligence officers questioned captured German soldiers, collaborators, or suspected spies, they did not produce polished summaries. They produced raw transcripts, typed or handwritten, often by non-native speakers, preserving cadence, dialect, hesitation, expletives, the messy reality of human communication under stress. A 1945 U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps transcript quotes a captured saboteur: "They taught us under trees. 2 days of hands-on, explosives and timers. Last night, before we were caught, we burned the papers in a ditch." That short quote, preserved in a classified memo, reveals training methods, timelines, disposal protocols. But it also preserves voice, syntax, phrasing, the way this particular person spoke when cornered. Historians prize these moments because they break through the flattening effect of official military language. You hear the person, you understand the fear, but those same qualities make the transcripts problematic. Voice is identifying. Pattern of speech can be traced. Families can recognize ancestors in transcripts even when names are redacted. Archives hold thousands of these documents. Some have been released with names blacked out, leaving pronouns and verbs floating in context. Others remain entirely sealed, considered too rich in identifying detail to redact effectively. Details too dangerous to reveal. The sensory fragments are what filmmakers and novelists dream about. A British Army medic's diary, from 1944, now declassified, describes treating wounded soldiers in Normandy. "Iodine smells like burnt apples. My hands are stained brown for hours after each shift. The canvas of the field tent amplifies rain, sounds like gravel being poured. Those lines give you the texture of war. You can feel the tent, smell the antiseptic, see the stained hands." But similar diaries remain in closed collections because they name patients, describe specific medical conditions, or reference events that intersect with classified operations. A Wehrmacht junior officer's diary, captured and translated by Allied intelligence, includes this entry from the Eastern Front in 1943. "We passed through orchards near Kursk. The air is apple-sweet from the trees, but the men are hollowed out, eyes like empty wells. 3 deserted last night." That paragraph appears in a paraphrased intelligence summary stamped "Secret Sources and Methods." The original diary, if it still exists, remains inaccessible. Why? Because the intelligence summary goes on to describe how the Allies obtained the diary. Through a turned German communications officer who continued feeding information to Soviet handlers for another 18 months. Revealing the diary reveals the source. Revealing the source reveals the network. Revealing the network exposes family members who may have known or been implicated or simply been related to someone whose wartime choices remain legally ambiguous. Every detail is a thread. Pull it and something unravels. Photographs present their own classification nightmare. Wartime aerial reconnaissance produced thousands of reels of 35mm and 16mm film, raw, unannotated strips showing enemy territory, supply lines, industrial facilities, civilian neighborhoods. Much of it has been released. Some remains withheld. The reason is technological, not historical. Modern high-resolution scanning and geolocation software can extract information from old reconnaissance photos that was invisible to 1940s analysts. A grainy image of a rail yard in occupied Poland can now be cross-referenced with modern satellite data to identify buildings, foundations, property lines. In some cases, those buildings are still in use by national security agencies. In other cases, releasing the photos could trigger property restitution claims from families who can prove, with photographic evidence, that structures or land belonged to their ancestors before wartime confiscation. The past is not dead, it is litigious. Then there are the lists. Governments love lists: transportation manifests, personnel rosters, inventory sheets, payment ledgers, ration distribution records, the bureaucratic sinew of wartime operations. Many of these lists remain classified not because they contain sensitive intelligence, but because they contain names organized by category, and some of those categories are morally damning. Lists of ethnic Germans expelled from post-war Czechoslovakia, with destination camps noted. Lists of Soviet citizens forcibly repatriated to Stalin's USSR under Operation Keelhull, with handover dates and locations. Lists of collaborators identified by resistance networks, annotated with recommendations: arrest, monitor, ignore, Useful, lists of looted art with chain of custody entries that name military personnel, civilian officials, and private buyers who acquired items under questionable circumstances. A single line from a Monuments Men inventory sheet, declassified in the early 2000s, reads, Canvas, Flemish School, circa 1600, unsigned. Removed from private residence Munich, address unknown. Deposited collecting point 19, August 1945. That terse notation became the legal foundation for a decades-long provenance battle over a painting now worth tens of millions of dollars. Museums, heirs, and governments are still in court over that single canvas. Archivists know there are hundreds more inventory sheets like it, still sealed, still awaiting the legal structures to manage what happens when they are released. Because releasing the list is not the end of the process. It is the beginning of 100 lawsuits. Some of the most explosive files are not in national archives, but in municipal records, quietly held by local governments that processed them during occupation and liberation. A municipal ration ledger from Amsterdam, dated 1944, lists daily bread allocations in grams per person. Beside the official ration, someone has noted in pencil, black market price 2 guilders. That annotation, a tiny economic snapshot, is the kind of micro-evidence historians treasure. But the ledger also includes names and addresses. Releasing it would expose who received extra rations, who collaborated with occupation authorities to access food supplies, who survived the hunger winter, and how. Those questions still echo in Dutch families. The municipal archives keep the ledgers, but access is restricted pending privacy reviews that have dragged on for decades. The files are not hidden because no one wants to know. They are hidden because too many people do. As more documents inch toward declassification, the pattern becomes clear. The files that remain sealed the longest are those that combine three elements: specific human identifiers, moral ambiguity, and ongoing legal relevance. A battle plan can be declassified the moment the war ends. A list of informants with addresses and physical descriptions? That stays sealed until everyone named is dead. A diplomatic cable revealing secret bargains over post-war borders? That stays sealed as long as those borders are contested. A technical blueprint that influenced Cold War weapons development, that stays sealed as long as the descendants of those weapons are still deployed. The clock is not running on history, it is running on liability, but the most troubling files are not the ones kept for legal or security reasons. They are the ones kept because of moral embarrassment. The files that document not enemy crimes, but allied compromises, the immunity deals, the recruitment bargains, the quiet trades of justice for intelligence. And those files, they are not waiting for the last veteran to die. They are waiting for the last uncomfortable question to be forgotten. The smell of chalk dust and formaldehyde hung in the air of a requisitioned German laboratory on May 23, 1945. U.S. Army intelligence officers stood among rows of technical notebooks, each one bound in black cloth, each one containing precise chemical formulas, engineering schematics, and test results that would shape American weapons development for the next 40 years. What they did next would remain classified longer than the war itself. Operation Paperclip, the program that recruited more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to work for the United States, produced thousands of personnel files, immigration documents, security clearances, and salary records. Many of these files were declassified in the 1980s and 90s, revealing the scope of the program and the identities of its most prominent recruits. Werner von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, who became the architect of the Apollo program. Arthur Rudolph, production manager at the Mittelwerk underground factory, who later designed the Saturn V. Hubertus Strughold, the father of space medicine, whose research built on data from hypothermia experiments conducted at Dachau. But the files that remain sealed in 2025 are not about the famous names. They are about the negotiations, the explicit moral bargains, the legal paperwork used to sanitize war crimes, the salary figures and housing assignments that reveal exactly how much the U.S. government was willing to pay for technical expertise, regardless of how that expertise was acquired. A partially declassified memo from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, dated September 19, 1946, discusses a chemical weapons researcher whose name remains redacted. The memo notes, subject's technical knowledge of nerve agent production methods exceeds that of any Allied scientist. Previous affiliation with SS Chemical Warfare Division presents legal complications. Recommend visa approval contingent upon modified employment history. Anticipated salary $18,000 annually, housing provided, naturalization expedited. That figure, $18,000 in 1946, equivalent to roughly $250,000 in 2025, reveals the premium. The U.S. placed on weapons research. The phrase modified employment history reveals the mechanism by which inconvenient facts were erased. The full personnel file, including the scientist's original SS records, interrogation transcripts, and the specific falsifications made to his immigration paperwork, remains classified. The justification, protecting intelligence sources and methods. The reality, protecting reputations and avoiding lawsuits from families who might seek to void the immunity deals that allowed war criminals to become American citizens. Technical blueprints pose a different classification problem. Captured German weapons research, jet engine designs, rocket propulsion systems, infrared targeting technology, chemical weapons formulas, was shared among Allied nations in the immediate post-war period. Much of this material has been released as the technology became obsolete or widely known, but sections remain classified when they reveal provenance. When you can trace a specific Cold War weapons system back to a specific captured German prototype, you create an uncomfortable historical record. You show that American innovation was not always American, that the rockets that took men to the moon descended directly from the rockets that killed thousands in London and Antwerp, that the chemical weapons stockpiled during the Cold War were refined versions of formulas developed for use in concentration camps. The line between war prize and war crime. Governments prefer that line to remain blurry. Declassifying the full chain of custody makes it sharp. A captured German laboratory notebook dated February 12, 1944, contains a precise recipe for incendiary gel, an early version of napalm. That page was photocopied into Allied ordnance files and formed the basis for American napalm development programs in the 1950s and 60s. The original notebook, along with interrogation records of the chemist who created it, was classified for decades. When portions were finally released in the 1990s, the chemist's name was redacted. Why? Because his work continued under American sponsorship until his death in 1967. Because revealing his identity would connect American napalm use in Vietnam directly to German incendiary weapons research. Because the moral math of that connection, using Nazi-derived weapons in a war justified as defending freedom, was too uncomfortable to make explicit. The chemistry is not the secret. The inheritance is. Then there are the diplomatic cables. Secret wartime correspondence between Allied governments contains not just military coordination, but post-war settlement plans, agreements about borders, populations, reparations, and spheres of influence that were never publicly ratified, but nonetheless shaped the world we live in. A British Foreign Office cable from July 19, 1945, records a conversation between British and Soviet representatives about post-war Poland. The cable includes this line: pragmatic silence chosen, deal struck on papers, verbal assurances given regarding population transfers. The attachments that would explain exactly what verbal assurances were given remain sealed. Why? Because those assurances concerned the forced relocation of millions of ethnic Germans from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary, population transfers that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions more. Modern Poland, Germany, and Czech Republic all have political reasons to avoid revisiting the exact terms under which those transfers were arranged. Some truths are too expensive to confirm. Wartime files also document the logistics of population movement with bureaucratic precision that is both invaluable and horrifying. Transportation manifests from April 1945 list railway cars loaded with specific cargoes. 72 cars, crates marked optical glass, fragile, origin, Gina, destination, depot, 7B. Later investigation revealed the optical glass included camera lenses and precision instruments looted from occupied factories. But the manifest also lists the German railway workers who loaded the cars, the guards who accompanied them, the depot personnel who received them. Those names create a chain of custody that extends to present-day property claims, museums holding instruments from those shipments, corporations that absorbed the looted manufacturing capacity, governments that distributed the assets, all have legal exposure if the full manifests are released. The manifest itself is historical record. The lawsuits it would trigger are contemporary reality. Some files remain sealed for reasons that have nothing to do with national security and everything to do with environmental liability. Lists of chemical stockpiles from 1945 document the disposal of captured German weapons. Mustard agent, 400 drums, buried north of Hanover, coordinates appended. Tabun nerve agent, estimated 6 tons, neutralized with caustic solution, disposed in sealed pit, location marked. Those coordinates and disposal methods are occasionally kept secret because modern environmental agencies use them to track contamination, But they are also kept secret because disclosure can spark massive cleanup costs and liability claims against governments that simply buried the problem and hoped time would solve it. The contamination is still there. The files prove who knew. Audio recordings from war crimes trials present another category of sensitive material. Acetate discs from the immediate post-war years capture testimony in scratchy, deteriorating sound. Voices of survivors, perpetrators, witnesses. Many of these recordings have been digitized and released, but some remain in restricted custody because the testimony implicates people who later held public office in Western governments. A resistance fighter who testified about collaboration might describe a local official who provided intelligence to occupying forces. That official, granted immunity in exchange for post-war cooperation with Allied intelligence, might have gone on to serve in his nation's parliament, judiciary, or diplomatic corps. The recording proves the collaboration. The immunity deal proves the compromise. Together they destroy legacies, silence as historical method. The most devastating files are those that document moral choices in real time. A Polish underground courier's diary entry, paraphrased in an Allied intelligence brief from 1944, reads, "We cut the post in half, hope rides in the seam." That poetic line, describing how resistance members hid messages inside hollowed fence posts, appears in a report that remains partially sealed. Why? Because the report goes on to name the courier, describe her route, identify her contacts, and detail what happened when the network was penetrated by German counterintelligence. 3 of the named contacts were executed, 2 survived by providing information to the Germans. One of the survivors later worked for British intelligence in post-war Berlin. Publishing the file destroys the survivor's reputation as a resistance hero and exposes the moral complexity of survival under occupation. Some stories have no good ending, only complicated ones. By 2025, the clearest pattern in what remains classified is this. The files that take longest to release are not those that reveal enemy capabilities, but those that reveal Allied choices. The immunity deals with war criminals. The recruitment of scientists with blood on their hands, the secret bargains over borders and populations, the technical inheritance from regimes we defeated, the environmental crimes we committed in the name of disposal, the moral compromises we made in the name of security. These files are not military secrets. They are moral receipts, and governments will protect them as long as anyone might ask for a refund. In a climate-controlled vault beneath the streets of Moscow, a file folder marked NKVD Operations Poland 1944 sits in a gray archival box. The folder is 4 centimeters thick. Inside are arrest dossiers, execution lists, interrogation summaries, and agent reports documenting Soviet counterintelligence operations behind German lines. The folder has been inventoried, catalogued, and digitally photographed for preservation, but it has never been released. It will not be released in 2025. It will likely never be released, because by the time legal restrictions expire, bureaucratic ones will have replaced them. By the time privacy concerns fade, diplomatic ones will have emerged. By the time one government decides transparency is safe, another will invoke reciprocal restrictions. The file will not be destroyed. That would be illegal. It will simply exist in perpetual administrative limbo, reviewed every few years and deferred every time, until the last person who remembers the war is gone, and then reviewed and deferred again, until caring about it becomes an act of historical archaeology rather than living memory. This is the trap closing on World War II's final secrets. Not suppression, but drift. Not active censorship, but passive bureaucratic inertia that functions the same way. The human cost of this drift is measured in questions that will never be answered. Families who cannot confirm what happened to missing relatives because the transportation manifests that list names stamped with S for sent or E for evacuated remain in restricted archives. Their annotations conflicting with survivor testimonies that were never officially recorded. Researchers who cannot reconcile casualty figures because the municipal death ledgers from occupied cities contain street-level details, addresses, ages, causes noted in handwriting that privacy laws forbid releasing, even when everyone named has been dead for half a century. Descendants who cannot pursue restitution claims because the property seizure documentation, numbered inventory sheets, photographs, claimant affidavits, remains partially sealed, considered too litigious to release without safeguards that no government wants to negotiate. The files exist, the answers are there, but the distance between existence and access grows wider every year. Consider what is lost when a file stays sealed for 80 years, and then finally is released to an audience that no longer remembers why it mattered. A declassified OSS report from 2023 describes a clandestine exfiltration operation in Yugoslavia in 1944. The report names safe houses, escape routes, local contacts who sheltered Allied agents at enormous risk. It is detailed, vivid, historically valuable. It was also released to general indifference. The media did not cover it. No documentaries were made. The families of the named contacts, if they even exist, if they even know their grandparents' wartime roles, were never notified. The secrets were kept for 78 years, and when they were finally revealed, no one was watching. Secrecy that outlasts memory becomes pointless, but it continues anyway. The bureaucratic mechanisms of classification have developed their own momentum, independent of the original justifications. A file marked "Foreign Government Consultation Required" enters a diplomatic queue, where it waits for another nation to review and approve release. That nation, busy with its own declassification backlog, defers review. Years pass. The original requester retires, a new archivist inherits the case, sees the deferral, and moves on to other files. The system is not designed to deny access permanently, it is designed to process requests fairly. But fairness at scale becomes paralysis. When 50 governments must coordinate the release of a single file that touches on joint operations, the file never moves. The greatest protection for secrets is not locks, it is process. Some files are sealed by explicit classification stamps. Others are sealed by bureaucratic complexity so dense that no researcher has the time or resources to navigate it. The provenance research for a single museum painting can require accessing 35 separate archive boxes, each held by different institutions in different countries, each with different access rules and consultation requirements. A German inventory note from 1943, a French police seizure report from 1944, a British Monuments Men assessment from 1945, an American restitution claim from 1947, all necessary to establish ownership, none held in the same archive. The information is not hidden, it is simply scattered beyond practical assembly, fragmentation as censorship by another name. The most troubling realization is that the files still sealed in 2025 represent only the visible tip of what was never recorded at all. For every classified interrogation transcript, there were a dozen interrogations never transcribed. For every documented immunity deal, there were handshake agreements that left no paper trail. For every list of informants carefully hidden in restricted archives, there were networks that operated on trust alone, their existence known only to those who participated. The classified files at least exist, the lost history does not. Oral testimony dies with the last witness, unwritten agreements dissolve with the last participant. Informal networks vanish when no one remembers they existed. What we are losing is not just files. It is the connective tissue of history, the informal relationships, the verbal assurances, the gentlemen's agreements that shaped outcomes as much as any signed treaty. A British ambassador's cable from 1945 notes deals struck on papers, but the papers were never filed with the cable, or were filed separately and have since been lost, or were deliberately kept out of archives entirely. We know the deal happened, we will never know its exact terms. The file tells us there is a hole in the historical record, it cannot fill the hole. Governments have learned that the most effective form of secrecy is not hiding files, but hiding the fact that files should exist. As the 80th anniversary of the war's end passes into the 81st, 82nd, 85th year, the window for full transparency narrows, the veterans are gone, the witnesses are gone. The children of witnesses are now elderly. The moral urgency that once drove declassification efforts, letting families know what happened to their loved ones, exposing war crimes while perpetrators could still face justice, setting the historical record straight while memory was fresh, has faded into academic interest. Important but not urgent. Valuable but not vital. The files will be released eventually, everyone agrees, just not now. Not while there are other priorities. Not while legal questions remain unresolved. Not while diplomatic sensitivities persist. Eventually becomes never, one deferral at a time. Yet the secrets do leak. Slowly, incompletely, often accidentally. An archivist misfiles a document in a declassified box. A researcher notices a redaction that failed to cover a name completely. A foreign archive releases a file that cross-references a document still sealed in another country, providing enough context to infer what the classified version says. The truth emerges in fragments, each one too small to matter individually but collectively sketching a picture no government wanted to reveal. History finds a way, but slowly. So slowly. In College Park, Maryland, the archivist closes another box, logs another deferral, moves on to the next case. The red stamp remains, the secrets hold. Not forever, nothing holds forever, but long enough. Long enough that the people who could be hurt are dead. Long enough that the lawsuits lose momentum. Long enough that the moral questions feel historical rather than urgent. Long enough that when the truth finally emerges, it feels like archaeology rather than revelation. The files will outlive the war by a century or more. The question is whether they will outlive the reasons for keeping them secret, or whether those reasons will simply evolve evolve, finding new justifications for old silences, protecting new interests with old classifications, transforming wartime secrets into permanent bureaucratic artifacts that exist in perpetual restriction. 80 years after the shooting stopped, the war is not over. It has simply moved into the archives, where it continues as a different kind of conflict, fought not with weapons but with stamps, memos, deferral notices, and procedural delays. A quiet war between those who believe history belongs to everyone and those who believe some truths are too expensive to share. The boxes sit in their vaults, temperature-controlled, carefully preserved, meticulously catalogued, waiting for a future that may never ask the right questions or may no longer care about the answers.